victory's prize itself and to do some good. By the way, our Nortons will tell us that his spelling of Millet altered over time. I'll let you run that to ground on your own. Both for victory's prize itself and to do some good. After years of those aims and pursuits, I found myself remaining possessed at the age of 31 to 33 with a special desire and conviction, or rather, to be quite exact, a desire that had been flitting through my previous life or hovering on the flanks, mostly indefinite hitherto, had steadily advanced to the front, defined itself, and finally dominated everything else. This was a feeling or ambition to articulate and faithfully express in literary or poetic form and uncompromisingly my own physical, emotional, moral, intellectual, and aesthetic personality in the midst of all, and tallying, he loves that word, right, and tallying the momentous spirit and facts of immediate days and of current America, and to exploit that personality, notice capitalized, identified with place and date in a far more candid and comprehensive sense than any hitherto poem or book. So here we go, he's going to make the argument, nothing like Leaves of Grass had ever been attempted. And he's going to say, for that very reason, I had to attempt it, whether it was, completely perfect or not. And then he comes back to this word, perhaps. Perhaps this is in brief, or suggests all I have sought to do. Given the 19th century, with the United States and what they furnish as area and points of view, Leaves of Grass is, or seeks to be simply, a faithful and doubtless self-willed record. So in one way we can read Leaves of Grass, it's just simply, it's a record of the experiences of the 19th century. In the midst of all, it gives one man's, the author's, identity, ardors, observations, faiths, and thoughts, colored hardly at all with any decided coloring from other faiths or identities. Now, obviously, a whole lot of this we can contest, right? And our study of Leaves of Grass has, in fact, contested much of what he just said. Plenty of songs had been sung, beautiful, matchless songs, we think obviously of Longfellow, adjusted to other lands than these, in other words, more in the European strain, we might say. Another spirit and stage of evolution, remember his love of that word and that idea. But I would sing and leave out or put in quite solely with reference to America and today. Modern science and democracy seem to be throwing out their challenge to poetry to put them in its statements in contradictions to the songs and myths of the past. As I see it now, perhaps too late, I have unwittingly taken up that challenge and made an attempt at such statements, which I certainly would not assume to do now, knowing more clearly what it means. For grounds for Leaves of Grass as a poem, I abandoned the conventional themes which do not appear in it. None of the stock ornamentation or choice plots of love or war. By the way, this sounds so much like that introduction of Milton's Paradise Lost, where he said that he was going to stay away from rhyming and just use blank iambic pentameter and all of that. None of the stock ornamentation or choice plots of love or war or high exceptional personages of old world song. Nothing, as I may say, for beauty's sake. In other words, I'm not playing Longfellow's game. No legend or myth or romance. By the way, with this use of the word myth, Nortons will remind us that the cross-reference here is the poem Great Are the Myths, which Whitman excluded from Leaves of Grass. More often than he remembered, he had referred to Leaves of Grass in the ancient heroic myths, and unconsciously he contributed to a new American myth rooted in the folklore of an expanding frontier in the American earth and in the democracy of the common man and natural faith. In fact, many have argued that America's truest myth is in fact Leaves of Grass. Or romance, of course, that's funny as well, given all the stuff he wrote about. But we understand what he means when he talks about Walter Scott later. Nor euphemisms, nor rhyme. Of course, we think about the few moments in Leaves of Grass, Oh Captain, My Captain, elsewhere, where there is a sense of rhyme and rhythm. But the broadest average of humanity, there's his goal, and its identities in the now ripening 19th century, of course, the 20th century soon to begin, and especially in each of their countless examples and practical occupations in the United States today. One main contrast of the ideas behind every page of my verses, and here Nortons will tell us this entire paragraph foreshadows those changes in poetry, which by 1925 fulfilled Whitman's prophecy that the poetic genius must emigrate into a new area of reality, of ultimate vivification, of the new knowledge of man, society, and the objective universe, which is why when Nortons created, many years ago, its poetry anthology of modern poetry, the very first poet to be mentioned in chronological order was who? Walt Whitman, right. One main contrast of the ideas behind every page of my verses compared with established poems is their different relative attitude towards God, think about Song of Myself 48, towards the objective universe, and still more by reflection, confession, assumption, etc., the quite changed attitude of the ego. Think about the power that just a few years later, Freud would be publishing his classic essays. The one chanting or talking towards himself and towards his fellow humanity, which is, of course, exactly what Song of Myself is and does. It's certainly time for America, above all, to begin this readjustment in the scope and basic point of view of verse, for everything else has changed. As I write, I see in an article on Wordsworth in one of the current English magazines the lines, quote, "A few weeks ago, an eminent French critic said that, owing to the special tendency to science and to its all-devouring force, poetry would cease to be read in 50 years, end quote. But I anticipate the very contrary." So here it is. This is the old argument, poetry is dead. Several of you commenting that when we started Talks with Walt, that nobody would actually follow along because nobody reads poetry anymore. Certainly nobody reads old poems anymore, right? I think Whitman is onto something here when he says, no, I think people are still going to read poetry. Watch, he says it only this way. Only, he says, a firmer, vastly broader, new area begins to exist, nay, is already formed, to which the poetic genius must emigrate. Whatever may have been the case in years gone by, the true use for the imaginative faculty of modern times is to give ultimate vivification to facts, to science, and to common lives, endowing them with the glows and glories and final illustriousness which belong to every real thing, and to real things only. Without that ultimate vivification, which the poet or other artistic alone, which the poet or other artist alone can give, reality would seem incomplete, and science, democracy, and life itself finally in vain. In other words, poetry is going to explain why all this other stuff matters. Few appreciate the moral revolutions our age, which have been profounder far than the material or inventive or war-produced ones. The 19th century, now well towards its close, and ripening into fruit the seeds of the two preceding centuries. And then he'll give a note here, the ferment and germination, even in the United States today, dating back to, in my opinion, mainly founded on the Elizabethan age in English history, the age of Francis Bacon and Shakespeare. It's fascinating, that's where he goes. Indeed, when we pursue it, what growth or advent is there that does not date back until lost? Perhaps its most tantalizing clues lost in the recorded horizons of the past. And again, this little note will tell us that he's going to argue that everything is the culmination, again, a very evolutionary point of view. The uprisings of national masses and shiftings of boundary lines and historical and other prominent facts of the United States, the war of attempted succession, again, that's what he will always call it, the stormy rush and haste of nebulous forces. Never can future years witness more excitement and din of action, never completer change of army front along the whole line, the whole civilized world. For all these new and evolutionary facts, meanings, purposes, new poetic messages, new forms and expressions are inevitable. In other words, evolution happens in culture, evolution happens in biology, evolution must happen in poetics. And then he'll capitalize the word book. My book and I, remember he would comment this phrase, my book and the War Won. My book and I, what a period we have presumed to span, exclamation point. Those 30 years from 1850 to 1880, and America in them, another exclamation point. Proud, again he stacks the words. Proud indeed may we be if we have culled enough of that period in its own spirit to worthily waft a few live breaths of it to the future. And again, exclamation point. And go back to our study at Learnstone of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. I'll just use that as our example. Part 5, right, where he says, I hope that this can send a spark to the future, right? If winter come, can spring be far behind. And then he says, let me not dare here or anywhere, for my own purposes or any purposes, to attempt the definition of poetry, notice capitalized, nor answer the question what it is like religion, love, nature, while those terms are indispensable and we all give a sufficiently accurate meaning to them. In my opinion, no definition that has ever been made succinctly encloses the name poetry, nor can any rule or convention ever so absolutely obtain, but some great exception may arise and disregard and overturn it. In other words, he's answering the accusation, dude, whatever it is you're writing in Leaves of Grass, it ain't poetry, okay? And to which he responds by saying, well, I don't think there's a single definition of poetry. And in this regards, he invents modern poetry and poetics. Also, just to continue now, it must be carefully remembered, that first-class literature, now we're going to get into the canonicity question, does not shine by any luminosity of its own, nor do its poems. They grow of circumstances and are evolutionary. In other words, here he's making the argument that Harold Bloom would, of course, love, and that is that the greatest texts are the ones that are handed through time evolutionarily. They continue to speak. The reason we love Shakespeare today is a different reason from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but we still love Shakespeare. Why? Not because somebody told us that we needed to. No, no, no. It's because, as we have said in our lectures on Shakespeare, because Shakespeare asked the questions of life and sometimes answered them. And these questions, of course, are going to continue to evolve, as will, of course, our study of Lisa Grass. The actual living light is always curiously from elsewhere. Again, I love his use of the word curiously. Follows unaccountable sources, and it's lunar and relative at the best. I love how he uses the word lunar. It makes us think about learned astronomer. There are, I know, he says, certain controlling themes that seem endlessly appropriated to the poets, as war in the past, in the Bible, religious rapture and adoration, always love, beauty, and some fine plot, or pensive or other emotion. But, strange as it may sound at first, I will say there is something striking far deeper and towering far higher than those themes for the best elements of modern song. Fascinating. In other words, you can make the argument. We needed Homer, Shakespeare, Milton, Dante, Chaucer. But all of those bring us now to a modern poetry. What's that going to look like? Just as all the old imaginative works rest after their kind on long trains of presuppositions, often entirely unmentioned by themselves, yet supplying the most important basis of them, and without which they could have had no reason for being. So, Leaves of Grass, before a line was written, presupposed something different from any other, and as it stands is the result of such presupposition. In other words, what was the intentionality from the very beginning? I should say, indeed, it were useless to attempt reading the book without first carefully tallying, again his use of that word that Harold Bloom loves so much, that preparatory background and quality in the mind. Think of the United States today, he says. The facts of these 38 or 40 empires soldiered in one, 60 or 70 millions of equals with their lives, their passions, their future, these incalculable modern American seething multitudes around us, of which we are inseparable parts, exclamation point. Think in comparison of the petty, I love his adjectives here, of the petty envirage and limited area of the poets of past or present Europe, no matter how great their genius. Think of the absence and ignorance in all cases hitherto of the multitudinous validity and the unprecedented similitudes of today and here. It almost seems as if a poetry with cosmic and dynamic features of magnitude and limitlessness suitable to the human soul were never possible before. In other words, what I have accomplished, he says, Leaves of Grass, couldn't have happened before. Now, of course, in some ways, we know that's absolutely true, given some of the sexual themes that he messed with. It is certain that a poetry of absolute faith and equality for the use of the democratic masses never was. And again, en masse is used right there in that very first poem, you'll remember. In estimating first-class song, a sufficient nationality, notice capitalized, or on the other hand, what may be called the negative and lack of it, as in Goethe's case it sometimes seems to me, again referencing maybe the greatest writer of them all in Germany, is often, if not always, the first element. One needs only a little penetration to see, or more or less removes the material facts of their country and radius with the coloring of the moods of humanity at the time and its gloomy or hopeful prospects behind all poets and each poet, and forming their birthmarks. I know very well that my Leaves could not possibly have emerged or been fashioned or completed from any other era than the later half of the 19th century, nor any other land than democratic America, and from the absolute triumph of the National Union arms. In other words, it had to come out of America. It couldn't come from anywhere else. And whether my friend claim it or not for me, I know well enough too that in respect to pictorial talent, dramatic situations, and especially in verbal melody and all the conventional technique of poetry, not only the divine works that today stand ahead in the world's reading, but dozens more transcend, I love that he uses that word, some of them immeasurably transcend, all I have done or could do. But it seemed to me, as the objects in nature, the themes of aestheticism, and all special exploitations of the mind and soul involve not only their own inherent quality, but the quality just as inherent and important of their point of view. And then he provides a footnote where he says, according to Immanuel Kant, the last essential reality giving shape and significance to all the rest. And I love that he mentions Kant here. The time had come to reflect all themes and things, old and new, in the lights thrown on them by the advent of America and democracy, to chant those themes through the utterance of one, not only the grateful and reverent legatee of the past, but the born child of the new world. In other words, I stand in the middle between Homer, Shakespeare, Chaucer, Dante, and whatever's coming, that is to say us. And he says, to illustrate all through the Genesis and ensemble of today, and that such illustration and ensemble are the chief demands of America's prospective imaginative literature, not to carry out in the approved style some choice plot of fortune or misfortune or fancy or fine thoughts or incidences or courtesies, all of which has been done overwhelmingly and well, probably never to be excelled, but that while in such aesthetic presentation of objects, passions, plots, thoughts, etc., our lands and days do not want and probably will never have anything better than they already possess from the bequests of the past. Nobody's ever going to do it better than Shakespeare, is what he's saying, right? It still remains to be said that there is even towards all those a subjective and contemporary point of view appropriate to ourselves alone and to our new genius and environments different from anything hitherto, and that such conception of current or gone by life and art is for us the only means of their assimilation consistent with the Western world. In other words, there isn't a poem yet for the Western world, modern Western world, that is to say, America, and I had to be that. He continues and almost doubled down. Indeed, and anyhow, to put it specifically, has not the time arrived when, if it must be plainly said for democratic America's sake, if for no other, there must imperatively come a readjustment of the whole theory and nature of poetry. Now, this is radical for his day. This is one of those essays that artists and poets love to read, because here it is. This is his argument. There has to be a departure. Remember we said we're the stories we tell and retell? What's the second part of that, guys? We are also the stories we decide to accept or the stories we decide to reject. Now, Whitman is an evolutionist, so transcend and include. He's going to keep his Homer, Shakespeare, etc., but he's going to transcend it in profound ways, and now he's going to give us some ideas about how he saw that happening. The question is important, and I may turn the argument over and repeat it. Does not the best thought of our day and republic, again he's using Plato's term, conceive of a birth and spirit of song superior to anything past or present? To the effectual and moral consolation of our lands, already as materially established, the greatest factors in known history and far, far greater through what they preclude and necessitate and are to be in the future. In other words, isn't it time for something new? To conform with and build on the concrete realities and theories of the universe furnished by science, and henceforth only irrefutable basis for anything, verse included, to root both influences in the emotional and imaginative action of the modern time and dominate all that precedes or opposes them, is not either a radical advance and step forward or a new verbiture of the best song indispensable. Notice all these rhetorical questions which are going to make the argument, hey, it's time and I'm the guy to stand in and do it. The New World receives with joy the poems of the antique, with European feudalism's rich fund of epics, plays, ballads, seeks not in the least to deaden or displace those voices from our ear and era. By the way, this not in the least was read erroneously in the first edition, November Vows, and in the repeat of that volume. It was corrected in 1889. Holds them indeed as indispensable studies, influences, records, comparisons. In other words, we're not going to get rid of the old greats, he says, but through the dawn dazzle, I love that he hyphenates this, through the dawn dazzle of the sun of literature is in those poems for us today, though perhaps, again he uses the word, the best parts of current character in nations, social groups, or any man or woman's individuality, old world or new, are from them, and though if I were asked to name the most precious bequest to current American civilization from all the hitherto ages, I'm not sure, but I would name those old and less old songs ferried hither. I love he uses ferried, right, given Brooklyn Ferry, from east and west. Some serious words and debits remain. Some acrid considerations demand a hearing. Of the great poems received from abroad and from the ages and today enveloping and penetrating America, is there one that is consistent with these United States or essentially applicable to them as they are and are to be? Is there any one whose underlying basis is not a denial and insult to democracy? What a commitment it forms, anyhow, on this era of literary fulfillment, with a splendid day rise of science and restitution of history, that our chief religious and political and poetical works are not our own, nor adapted to our light, but have been furnished by far back ages out of their area and darkness, or at most twilight dimness, and an exclamation point. In other words, dude, we got to get beyond Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton. What is there in those works that so imperiously and scornfully dominates all our advanced civilization and culture? Another question. Notice all these questions, these rhetorical questions. And we're basically halfway through this 500-line essay, and now he's going to go at Shakespeare. Even Shakespeare. And of course, Harold Bloom arguing, I think rightfully so, the greatest writer of all time is Shakespeare. But notice Whitman is going to have this dialogue with Shakespeare. Even Shakespeare, who so suffuses current letters and art, which indeed have in most degrees grown out of him, belongs essentially to the buried past. Only he holds the proud distinction for certain important phrases of the past, of being the loftiest of the singers life has yet given voice to. Notice he calls Shakespeare a singer, I love that. All, however, relate to and rest upon conditions, standards, politics, sociologies, ranges of belief that have been quite eliminated from the Eastern Hemisphere and never existed at all in the Western. In other words, we kind of outgrown Shakespeare, is his argument. As authoritative types of song, they belong in America just about as much as the persons and institutes they depict. True, it may be said, the emotional, moral, and aesthetic natures of humanity have not radically changed, that in these, the old poems apply to our times and all times, irrespective of date, and that they are of incalculable value as pictures of the past. I willingly make those admissions, and to their fullest extent, then advance the points herewith as of serious, even paramount importance. In other words, I'm willing to accept the importance of Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare has to accept the importance of me and Leaves of Grass. I have indeed put on record elsewhere my reverence and eulogy for those never to be excelled poetic bequests and their indescribable preciousness as heirlooms for America. Notice they're for America, not of America, right? Another and separate point must now be candidly stated. If I had not stood